Welcome to episode 2 of the Northern Pacific Railroad History Project. First of all, my apologies for not having been here for so long. As they say, life gets in the way sometimes, and it certainly has for me over the past year. Maybe more on that later, but right now we've got to catch up. We're going to be turning the calendar back over 60 years. We're going to go back to 1956 because we're going to make a train trip all the way from New York City, Grand Central Station, going west 3,300 miles all the way out to the Pacific Coast, Seattle, Washington, and King Street Station. We take the pride of the Northern Pacific, the North Coast Limited streamliner, for most of that trip, all the way from Chicago out to Seattle, which is about 2/3 of the way across the country. And I have 2 tickets here for the Northern Pacific North Coast Limited. One for you, one for me. And I also have a handy dandy Northern Pacific map of the United States. We're going to be referring to that. We're going to be seeing video as well as old photos. The video is that I've taken over the past 20 years. The photos are just that, old historical photos, and then sometimes Northern Pacific advertisements. We'll see the route in both summer and winter weather. And we're going to be referring to times of day. We'll call out the night times and the daytime and so on. I'm going to assume for that it's the middle of summer and the sun comes up sometime around 6 a.m. and sets sometime around 9 p.m. at night. For instance, North Dakota, we enter that in the dark sometime around 11 o'clock at night, and we get out of there just as the sun is coming up as we enter Montana. So, well, let's get going. Our 20th Century Limited train arrives at Chicago's LaSalle Street Station at 7:45 a.m., which gives us 3 hours and 45 minutes to get over to Chicago's Union Station, which is where we'll catch the North Coast Limited for the remainder of our journey. The North Coast Limited looks a little bit peculiar at this point because it's being hauled by locomotives of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, and that's because the Burlington owns the tracks between Chicago and the Twin Cities, which is a 427-mile run. So this afternoon we'll be cruising along the Mississippi River in Northern Pacific cars with Northern Pacific employees, but they're pulled by engines from the Burlington. St. Paul is the most important city along the Northern Pacific as it's their headquarters town. Also, it's the site of Northern Pacific's Northtown Freight Yards, which is a redistribution point where freight trains are disassembled and cars put on other trains to head to their destination. Much of the traffic here comes from Seattle, where the Northern Pacific picks up freight from Asia. St. Paul is also where the Burlington engines are removed and replaced with the handsome diesels of the Northern Pacific, which are done in a 2-tone paint scheme that matches the remainder of the train. As we leave St. Paul, we see some big flour mills. We jump over the Mississippi River into the other twin city, Minneapolis, where we spend a very brief 5 minutes, and then it's on into very dense forested areas, the core of Minnesota's lumber industry. The dense forests gradually give way to farmlands, and then more and more farmlands, which will eventually transition to the Great Plains as we hit North Dakota. We pass through a number of very small farm towns along the way, with our train hitting anywhere between 60 to 80 miles per hour. One person you are sure to have met by now is the stewardess nurse. Almost all the fancy passenger trains in the country had stewardesses, but the North Coast Limited was unique in that its stewardesses were also registered nurses. There are quite a few qualifications for these women, including 22 to 27 years in age, a height of 5'3" to 5'7", 115 to 135 pounds, and single, not widowed or divorced. The best but not only place to eat on the North Coast Limited was the dining car. For breakfast, lunch, or dinner, you sat down to a fine linen tablecloth, linen napkins, and real silver service. The menu tended to be Western with steaks, and of course the Northern Pacific's great big baked potato, which had heavily advertised. One place we won't see from the train because we pass a few miles away is the big former Northern Pacific shop complex in Brainerd, where they built cars and did a variety of work. Much of this complex is gone now, but from an aerial view you can actually see signs of the huge big roundhouse that was at Brainerd. From there, it's the only other stop in Minnesota outside of Minneapolis-St. Paul, and that's the town of Staples, which is not as active as it used to be. Then we cross the Red River and into the town of Fargo, North Dakota, just over the border from Minnesota. North Dakota is a nighttime crossing. There's not a whole lot of interest in North Dakota or interesting things to see. It's mostly a flat agricultural area with just a very few small towns. The North Coast Limited will make 5 stops. The biggest town is Bismarck, which probably had a population of around 20 to 30,000 in 1965. Tonight the only things visible are small towns and occasional yard lights of farms that some are so far away from the train that they stay in view for 5 minutes. If this were daytime, you'd see highlights including the 4,000-foot long Valley Highline Bridge. My absolute favorite landmark in all of North Dakota is the Bismarck Bridge, which spans the Missouri River just on the west side of the town of Bismarck, which is right in the center of North Dakota. This bridge was built, well, they started it in 1881. It was completed 13 months later in 1882. There are 3 400-foot spans, and then there's some additional trackage on each side of the main span, so the bridge is about 1,500 feet long. It was built mostly by hand, and there's very little mechanization, and incredibly the bridge is still in use today by the Burlington Northern Santa Fe. When the Northern Pacific built westward, their tracks stopped at the Missouri River in 1873 because they couldn't figure out how to get over the river, and also it was going to be very expensive to build a bridge. So incredibly, they put ties and rails on the frozen over Missouri River and ran their trains across that way. Can you imagine running big heavy locomotives and train cars with people in them over a frozen river? When the bridge was completed, they tested it by placing 8 fully loaded locomotives back to back on each of the bridge spans. And they figured if the bridge didn't cave under the weight of the locomotives, it would be okay. But I can't imagine being an engineer out there. So from Bismarck, we're going to jump out to the western part of the state, to the North Dakota Badlands, and finish our trip through North Dakota there. So we started out 11 p.m. last night, and at about 5 this morning, just before the sun comes up, we cross over into the state of Montana. We're going to enter Montana around Glendive on the eastern side from North Dakota, where we'll soon catch up with the Yellowstone River, which is the path that Lewis and Clark took across Montana back in the early 1800s. We'll go along the Yellowstone for quite a ways, so a couple of 100 miles. When we get down to Billings, Montana, about 15 years ago, the Northern Pacific Railroad Historical Association had its meeting in Billings. We had a fan train that ran from Billings all the way to Whitehall, which is a distance of about 200 miles, and we followed the Yellowstone River, went through the Gallatin Valley. We'll see footage of that trip from the dome cars as well as out the vestibule doors. We'll pass through Bozeman Pass. We'll take a look at that in both the winter and summertime. Then we'll get down to the Gallatin Valley and on to Whitehall. Then we'll go up into the Continental Divide of the Rocky Mountains. And the Northern Pacific had 2 routes over the Rockies, one through Mullen Pass and the other through Homestake Pass, one of the Reasons for that was there were so many problems up there with weather and tunnels and so on that they had two routes. We'll see which one the North Coast Limited took. Then we'll head up the beautiful Clark Fork River and eventually hit Idaho, where we cross Lake Pend Oreille on a beautiful summer morning. So please join me for episode 3, and I promise it won't be as long as it was between episodes 1 and 2. So we'll see you then.